wasn't the whispers in the dark that scared Elara. It was the day they stopped. The first time Elara heard the whispers, she was 7 years old, trying to extract a splinter from her thumb with her teeth. It was a rainy afternoon, and the old Blackwood Manor groaned and settled around her like a living beast. The sound was so faint she thought it was the hiss of rain through the ancient gutters. But then she heard her name. Elara. It was a thread of sound, a breath against stone. She froze, her small heart hammering against her ribs. The voice was neither kind nor cruel. It was simply present, like the dust motes dancing in the slanted light from the window. "Grandfather?" she called out, her voice small in the vast tapestry-hung hallway. Silence. Then a creak from above. Just the house, she told herself. It was always just the house. Blackwood Manor was her inheritance and her prison. A hulking edifice of gray stone and sorrow, it stood on the moors, perpetually shrouded in a low-hanging mist that smelled of damp earth and decaying roses. Her parents, bright and modern people, had died in a car crash on the winding road leading away from this very place when she was 5. They had hated the manor, visiting only out of duty. Elara was left in the care of her grandfather, Alistair Blackwood, the last in a long line of reclusive, eccentric men who seemed to be made from the same stone as their home. Alistair was a kind man, but distant, his eyes always focused on something just beyond the horizon. He never spoke of the whispers, but Elara knew he heard them too. Sometimes she would find him in his study, head cocked, listening to the empty air with a look of profound sadness on his face. "The house has a voice, child," he told her once, when she was brave enough to ask. "It remembers. It always remembers. Just never answer it back. Never give it a name." As Elara grew, the whispers became a constant background hum to her life. They were not conversations, but fragments. A half-remembered lullaby her mother used to sing, the rustle of pages from a book long lost, the faint echo of a laugh from a party held decades before she was born. They were the soundtrack to her solitude. She learned to sleep through them, to read while they murmured at the edge of her hearing. They were the house's breath, and she was and she was the house's breath, and she was tea, and she was a house's breath, and she was Tanem. They were the house's breath, and she was love. The only thing that truly frightened her was the silence. The first great silence happened when she was 12. It was preceded by a crescendo of whispers, a frantic, overlapping cacophony that felt like the house was having a fever dream. For 3 days, the murmurs grew louder, more insistent. Then, on the 3rd night, they ceased, completely. The absence of sound was a physical weight. Elara woke up, her ears straining against a void so absolute it felt deafening. There was no creak of floorboards, no sigh of the wind, no scuttling of mice in the walls. It was as if the world had been wrapped in cotton wool and submerged in deep water. The fear was immediate and primal. She ran to her grandfather's room, finding him already awake, pale and trembling by his window. "What is it, grandfather? What's happening?" He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the family graveyard, a collection of leaning headstones visible from his window. "It's feeding," he whispered, his voice cracking. What's feeding?" He just shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. "The silence feeds, and it's always hungry." The silence lasted for a week. During that time, the house felt dead. The air grew cold and stagnant. Food lost its taste. Colors seemed muted. Elara felt a profound loneliness, a hollow ache in her soul that the whispers, for all their strangeness, had somehow kept filled. When the first whisper finally returned, a faint, hesitant, cold, she wept with relief. The silences came every few years, each one longer and more profound than the last. By the time Elara was 25, her grandfather was gone, buried in the graveyard he had stared at so often. The manor and its voices were hers alone.
The silence began again on a Tuesday.
It started as it always did, with the whispers growing frantic. Elara was in the library, attempting to catalog the endless shelves of mildewed books. The murmurs, usually a gentle stream, became a raging river. The key is lost. The light fades. She doesn't see, doesn't hear. The roots are deep, so deep. She paused, a leather-bound volume of keys in her hand. A cold dread, familiar and icy, trickled down her spine. No, she whispered to the empty room. Not again. She spent the next 2 days preparing, a ritual born of painful experience. She filled every container she could find with water, fearing the pipes would fall silent too. She gathered non-perishable food, candles, and blankets in her bedroom, the smallest and most easily fortified room in the house. She closed and locked the heavy shutters, plunging the manor into an artificial night. On the third evening, as she sat huddled by her fireplace, the whispers reached their peak. They were no longer fragments, but a coherent, desperate plea. Elara, listen. The heart of the house, beneath the stone, where the shadow never moves. It must not be fed. Do not let the quiet take you. Remember the name. Remember the...
And then, nothing.
The silence fell. It was heavier this time, more aggressive. It pressed in on her eardrums, a high-pitched negation of sound that was somehow louder than any noise. The fire in her grate didn't crackle. Its flames seemed to freeze in place, burning without a sound. She hugged her knees to her chest, the old, childish fear washing over her. The first day was bearable. She read by candlelight, though the words felt flat and meaningless. She ate, though the bread was like ash in her mouth. The second day, the cold began to seep in. It wasn't the cold of winter, but a deep, marrow-chilling cold that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. She piled on blankets, but they did nothing.
On the third day of the silence, she saw the first change.
She was carrying a candle to the kitchen for more water when the flame, which had been burning silently and steadily, suddenly bent at a perfect 90-degree angle, as if blown by a fierce wind. Yet the air was perfectly still. The flame held its impossible angle for a full 10 seconds before snapping back to vertical. Elara stared, her breath catching in her throat. The laws of physics were becoming suggestions. Later in the grand hallway, she saw her reflection in a gilded mirror, but the reflection was a fraction of a second out of sync. When she raised her hand, her mirror self delayed, its movement sluggish, its eyes wide with a terror she didn't yet feel. She stumbled back, and the reflection mimicked her, its mouth opening in a silent scream.
The house was not just silent, it was coming undone.
The dread was no longer a passive feeling. It became an active presence. She felt watched, weighed, and measured. A sense of profound hunger filled the air, a starvation that was not her own. She remembered her grandfather's words, "The silence feeds." What did it feed on? Warmth, sound, light, or something else entirely? On the fourth day, she found the first crack. It was in the West Wing ballroom, a place she hadn't entered in years. A hairline fracture ran from the floor to the ceiling, not in the plaster, but in the very air. Through it, she didn't see the wall behind. She saw a shifting gray nothingness, a void that seemed to pulse with a slow, malevolent intelligence. As she watched, a tendril of that grayness, like smoke or liquid shadow, seeped through the crack of A's. Where it passed, the vibrant red of a Persian rug turned ashen and dull, as if its color had been drained. She ran, the silent thud of her feet on the carpet a bizarre and terrifying mockery of flight. That night, huddled in her bed, she made a decision. She could not just wait it out. The silence was not a natural cycle. It was an invasion. And it was winning. She had to fight back. But how do you fight nothingness? The frantic whisper from before the silence returned to her. Remember the name. Elara spent the next day, a terrifying, sunless stretch of time marked only by the ticking of a clock whose sound had been stolen in her grandfather's study. It was the heart of his world, a room she had always found comforting. Now it felt alien and threatening. The silence here was particularly dense, a thick syrup slowing her movements and her thoughts. She pulled down ledgers, diaries, and old family records. The Blackwood history was a litany of tragedy and reclusion. There were tales of suicides, mysterious disappearances, and long declines that doctors could not explain. Generation after generation, they had died in this house, rarely leaving the moors. In a heavy, iron-bound chest, hidden behind a false panel in the bookshelf, a secret her grandfather had shown her when she turned 18, she found the oldest documents. They were written in a cramped, archaic hand on vellum that crackled with age. They were the journals of the first Blackwood, Alaric Blackwood, who had built the manor in the 17th century. Alaric was not a nobleman or a merchant. According to his writings, he was a philosopher, a student of the spaces between things. He wrote of entities that existed outside of human perception, beings of void and silence that fed on the energy of creation, on sound, on light, on life itself. He called them the hush. "I have found a place," Alaric wrote, "where the veil is thin, a locus of quiet power. Here I shall build my sanctuary, a bulwark against the cacophony of the world. I have made a covenant. The hush will grant my line longevity and the wisdom of the void. In return, we shall provide it with an anchor, a focus for its feeding. We shall be the gatekeepers, and in the quiet moments we shall hear the truth of the universe." Elara's blood ran colder than the air in the room. A covenant, an anchor. Her family hadn't been cursed. They had made a deal. She read on, her hands trembling. The anchor, Alaric detailed, was a physical object, a conduit that bound the hush to the material world. It was hidden in the heart of the house, beneath the stone, where the shadow never moves. The exact phrase from the whisper. The later entries grew more frantic. Alaric realized his mistake too late. The hush was not a source of wisdom. It was a parasite. The longevity it offered was a half-life, tethered to its hunger. The whispers were not the voice of the house or the ghosts of the past. They were the last echoes of what the hush was consuming, the fading voices of her ancestors, trapped and slowly being erased. The silences were when the hush fed most actively, drawing energy not just from the house, but from the Blackwoods themselves. The final, barely legible entry in Alaric's journal was a warning. The covenant is a chain. The anchor must never be moved, for its destruction would release the hush upon the world. Yet to sustain it is to feed our souls to the void. There is but one hope, a name of binding, a word of creation that can temporarily hold the hunger at bay. It was given to me, but I was too proud to use it. I passed this secret down, though I fear my descendants will be as cowardly as I. The name is... The last word was a blotch of faded ink, illegible. Elara cried out in frustration, a silent scream that tore at her throat. The answer was there, but just out of reach. She rifled through the rest of the chest. Beneath the journals, her fingers brushed against cold, smooth metal. She pulled out a large, ornate silver locket. It was intricately engraved with twisting, thorny vines. With fumbling fingers, she pried it open. Inside was not a portrait, but a single folded piece of parchment. On it, in her grandfather's familiar, steady hand, was written a single word. Lumen. Light. Lumen. The name was a spark in the overwhelming gloom. It felt warm on her tongue, a tiny point of defiance against the all-consuming quiet. It was not a weapon to destroy, but a shield, a word of creation to hold back the void. But she still had to find the anchor. Beneath the stone, where the shadow never moves, she ran the phrase over and over in her mind. The cellar? The foundations? But the house was full of shadows, and they all moved with the non-existent sun. She thought of the architecture. The manor was built on a slight elevation. The only place where a shadow might never move was inside, a place perpetually in shadow. The family mausoleum. It was a small stone structure attached to the house, accessible through a heavy oak door in the east wing. It was where the Blackwoods were interred before being buried in the graveyard. It was a place of perpetual twilight, the only light filtering through a single stained glass window too high to cast any moving shadows. Her grandfather was there in his sealed sarcophagus. The thought of entering that place with the silence pressing down and the hush leaking through the cracks of reality made her want to vomit. But she had no choice. Armed with the name Lumen and a roaring, desperate courage, she left the study. The hallway outside was worse than before. Several of the air cracks were now visible, weeping strands of gray nothingness. A side table had been half consumed. One end was perfectly detailed, the other end faded into a featureless, ashen lump. The silence was no longer an absence. It was a corrosive presence, actively unmaking her world. She moved through the corpse of her home, her every footfall a silent protest. As she passed a particularly large crack in the air, a long, thin tendril of hush shot out towards her. It was code, a code that promised absolute zero and the end of all things. Instinctively, she opened her mouth and breathed the word.
Lumen.
The word made no sound, yet it manifested as a pulse of soft golden light that emanated from her. It was the light of a single candle in an infinite dark, fragile but unyielding. The tendril of hush recoiled, sizzling away like mist under a morning sun. The light lasted only a second, but the space around her felt clearer, warmer. The name worked, but it had cost her. She felt a deep fatigue, as if she had just run a mile. She felt a deep fatigue, as if she had just run a mile. She pressed on, reaching the heavy door to the mausoleum. The iron ring was freezing to the touch. She took a deep breath of dead air, pushed the door, and stepped into the tomb. It was exactly as she remembered, cold, dry, and filled with the stone coffins of her ancestors. The air was thick with dust and finality. In the center of the room was a simple, circular stone dais, and on the dais where no coffin rested was a single, black stone. It was about the size of a human heart, obsidian dark, and it seemed to drink the faint light from the stained glass window. It was perfectly smooth, featureless, and radiated a profound gravitational emptiness. This was it. The anchor. The source of the covenant. The hole through which the hush was feeding. As she stared at it, the silence in the room intensified, becoming a physical pressure that threatened to crush her lungs. The gray tendrils she had seen in the hallways began to coalesce around the stone, weaving together into a larger, more defined form. It was a shifting, humanoid shape of absolute void, with two pits of deeper darkness where eyes should be. The hush was manifesting. It turned its attention to her, and a wave of pure psychic starvation hit her. It was hungry for her light, her sound, her very existence. It began to glide towards her, silent and inexorable. Elara backed away, her heart a frantic, silent drum against her ribs. She raised a hand, and with all the will she could muster, she formed the word again.
Lumen.
The golden light flared, brighter this time, pushing the entity back a few feet. But the effort drove Elara to her knees. She was draining herself, and the hush was infinite. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with a teacup. The hush reformed, seeming larger now, angered by the resistance.
It was then that the whispers returned.
Not from the walls, but from the sarcophagi around her. Faint, desperate, the last echoes of the Blackwoods trapped in the locket of the hush's hunger.
Elara, my child, be strong. The name is not a shield, it is a key. Unlock the light, not just speak it, be it.
The voice of the last whisper was her grandfather's. Be the light, Elara. It is the only thing it cannot consume. The manifesting hush loomed over her, its void-like arms reaching for her face, promising not death, but uncreation. To be unmade, to become a whisper in its silent, eternal hunger. She understood. Speaking Lumen was using a tool. She had to become the concept. She had to fill the void with everything the hush was not. With memory, with sound, with life. Closing her eyes, she stopped fighting the fatigue. Instead of pushing the word out, she pulled it in. She thought of her mother's laugh, a sound she hadn't consciously remembered in years. She thought of the feel of the sun on her face, the taste of strawberries, the sound of rain on the roof, the weight of a book in her lap. She thought of her grandfather's kind eyes, the crackle of the library fire, the scent of old paper and beeswax. She gathered every memory, every sensation, every echo of life and love she had ever experienced. She forged them into a weapon not of defiance, but of affirmation.
She stood up, and she did not speak. She sang.
It was a wordless melody, a lullaby her mother had sung, its sound tearing through the silence like a thunderclap. The golden light did not pulse from her. She was the light. She blazed like a star in the heart of that dark place. The manifest hush shrieked, a tearing, silent sound that was the negation of a scream. It writhed, its form destabilizing, unable to process the sheer, violent abundance of life she was projecting. The light from her body struck the black anchor stone. For a moment it resisted, sucking at the light. Then a hairline crack appeared on its flawless surface. A sound, a tiny ping, echoed impossibly in the room. Another crack appeared, and then another. The whispers around her rose in a crescendo of hope and release. With a final, silent cry that was the echo of 1,000 lost voices, the hush was blown back into the cracks from whence it came. The gray tendrils vanished. The cracks in the air sealed themselves, and the oppressive weight of the silence shattered. And the black anchor stone exploded into a million fragments of inert dark dust. The sound was the first thing that returned. The groan of the manor settling, the distant hoot of an owl, the frantic, joyful beating of her own heart in her ears. It was a symphony. She collapsed onto the cold stone floor, weeping, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of sensation.
She had done it. She had broken the covenant.
In the days that followed, Blackwood Manor was different. The air was lighter. The mist on the moors seemed less cloying. The shadows were just shadows. The house still creaked and settled, but the sounds were random, natural. The intelligent, listening presence was gone. The whispers were silent, truly silent this time, their souls finally at rest. Elara walked through the halls, now filled with the honest sounds of her own footsteps and the wind outside. She opened the shutters, letting in the light and the sound of birdsong. The house was no longer a living entity. It was just a house, an old, dusty, beautiful house. She knew she could leave now. The chain was broken. She could sell the manor, move to a city, fill her life with people and noise. But as she stood in the library, watching the dust-mote stands in a sunbeam, real, ordinary dust, she realized she didn't want to. This was her home, not her prison. For the first time, it was truly hers. The legacy of the Blackwoods was no longer one of silence and fear, but of a hard-won peace. She was the last of her line, and she had freed them all. She picked up a book from the table, the Keats volume she had been holding when the last silence began. She opened it and began to read aloud, her voice clear and strong, filling the silent spaces not with dread, but with poetry. It wasn't the whispers in the dark that had saved her. It was the day she found the courage to answer them with a song. And in the quiet that followed, for the first time in her life, Elara heard not the hunger of the void, but the simple, beautiful sound of living.